The US Justice Department says it won't prosecute Goldman Sachs for financial fraud. 5 years after the start of the US's worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, why is no one being held accountable? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. Goldman Sachs lost $1.2 billion of its clients' money in the mortgage meltdown that began in 2007. But critics pointed to the firm's practices as a key factor in the global economic crisis that continues today. As Kristen Salumi reports, the decision not to prosecute Goldman Sachs or any of its employees comes after a year-long criminal investigation requested by a Senate committee.
In the wake of the financial crisis of 2008, Goldman Sachs became the poster child for banks' bad behavior. But according to the U.S. Justice Department, there's no evidence Goldman Sachs or its employees acted criminally. Based on the law and evidence as they exist at this time, there is not a viable basis to bring a criminal prosecution, the Justice Department said in a statement. The announcement reflects a double standard to groups like Dennis Kelleher's, which advocate for Wall Street oversight and regulation.
The uneasy feeling that Goldman Sachs is pretty powerful, it's extremely well connected, extremely wealthy, everybody knows all of that, and what do we have? We appear to have a behind the closed door decision not to prosecute him.
After the bank lost over $1 billion in the mortgage meltdown and touched off the worst recession since the 1930s, an outraged Senator Carl Levin took CEO Lloyd Blankfein to task for selling complex mortgage securities to banks and other investors that its own employees had secretly described as junk.
You are taking a position against the very security that you are selling, and you are not troubled.
Senator,
and you want people to trust you.
Senator, I think people
Why would
trust
people?
us.
I won't trust you.
Goldman Sachs welcomed the announcement, saying the bank was happy to put the issue behind them. But for President Barack Obama and other politicians who promised to hold Wall Street accountable, the decision not to prosecute could be a liability moving forward on the campaign trail.
Shame! Shame! Shame!
The public's outrage at banks, as witnessed during the Occupy Wall Street demonstrations, and the still struggling economy are expected to weigh heavily on voters come November. The Justice Department said it could reopen its investigation if new facts come to light. Until then, it looks like business as usual. Kristen Salumi, Al Jazeera, New York.
So, why haven't any of the major players in the financial crisis been prosecuted? Joining me to discuss this from New York is Richard Wolff. He's the author of the book, Capitalism Hits the Fan, The Global Economic Meltdown and What to Do About It. With me in the studio, Bartlett Naylor. He's a financial policy advocate. And Mary Cruz McGowan, an economist based in Washington, D.C. And before we go on, actually, it's probably worth mentioning it's been a pretty good week for Goldman Sachs. There's also various settlements on cases involving portfolios of subprime mortgages and their marketing and so forth with the Securities and Exchange Committee. So Goldman Sachs doing terribly well. Professor Wolff, what do you make of the Department of Justice's decision, and the SEC's decision for that matter?
Well, it's another milestone in a sad story that we know all too well, that we now have enterprises that are so big, so rich, that are so generous with their political contributions to both parties, that when they get themselves into trouble, when they drag the whole economy into a fundamental crisis, we not only avoid punishing them for all that they have done, but we bail them out with billions, nay, trillions of dollars to get them back on their feet so they can continue the activities we as a nation refuse to countenance in anyone else and that we suffer from in tangible ways. It could not be a more graphic description of who in the end controls the political economy of the United States and who pretends to on the other side.
Well, I mean, that's the point there. The potential for prosecution does come from a Senate committee, Bartlett, Naylor, and a 650-page report, pretty forensic report, actually, Wall Street and the financial crisis, anatomy of a financial collapse. And that did seem to be quite an accurate description, actually. What were the exact charges that seemed to potentially come out from that report?
Well, the most obvious one would be fraud, namely the enticement of customers into a product and then the delivery of something else. The emails contain confessions that are pretty blatant from Goldman Sachs traders as to what they were doing, whether they knew that what they were doing was lawful or not lawful. It seemed to me the prosecution evidence was handed fairly neatly with tabs and indexes and so forth to the Justice Department.
Well, Goldman Sachs is actively corralling terrible investments and financial instruments into one package and then selling it to its clients and saying this is the greatest thing, and then betting against their success.
It's going to pension funds. It's going to stewards of actual working people's money and saying, we think this is a good investment, when meanwhile the company, Goldman Sachs, knows that it is not. In fact, it is banking that is the opposite of what it's depicting.
But having said that, then, the DOJ, Mary-Louise McGowan, said, okay, I mean, clearly they launched an investigation. They said, though, the problem is they couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the intention of Goldman Sachs was to break the law. Do you feel that's
well,
the case?
I was very surprised about that statement, especially in the part that they said there's not enough evidence. The evidence is spread all over the country, in the hundreds and thousands of people that lost their homes, that are underwater, that keep paying more than what they should, and the people that lost their retirement funds.
Right, but the Washington Post would say no one saw that coming.
Exactly, then the Department of Justice comes with that. But I think we have to go to the point of this, to the root of this. I don't think it is really the first culprit, the Department of Justice, but the Securities and Exchange Commission, that should have already, when they started receiving these notices of something that was going wrong in 2006, when Goldman Sachs started selling to investors these derivatives. Maybe not in 2006, but why not 2007, 8, and so on, and they didn't do anything. And then this administration comes with an idea and says, okay, we have to protect the consumers, and they create the Agency for Consumer Protection Agency. And I was also baffled, and I said, okay, the solution to this problem is more bureaucracy? No, the SEC was created precisely to do this,
we'll get on
to stop this kind of behavior.
In a few moments, but as far as the case against Goldman Sachs is concerned, as presented in that Senate subcommittee report, Professor Wolf, from your review of the evidence, can you single out something there beyond a reasonable doubt that proves criminality?
Well, it's always the standard that is the question. For me and for most people who would bother to read that whole report, as for the Senate committee, most of them, it was crystal clear that there was something terribly wrong in what Goldman is doing. But the reality is that we have to face that agency after agency, not just the Justice Department, is confronted with the same dilemma. The pockets of Goldman Sachs to hire an army of lawyers, to hold up the government, to buy the public relations that will put the government in a bad light for however many years this drags on. These are all hard realities of allowing big concentrations of wealth like that to exist, so you get these outcomes. It wasn't a few months ago, but the SEC settled with Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs paid $550 million in what? An arrangement in which they admitted no wrongdoing. Obviously, if you didn't do anything wrong, you wouldn't be paying $550 million. This kind of fiction that allows both sides to back away from a confrontation neither side is sure it can win, that's the sign of an economic system.
Why couldn't the Justice Department win this? Was there no smoking gun? Was there no clear paper trail that showed criminal activity beyond a reasonable doubt?
There was, probably, but Goldman Sachs has all the expertise and limitless money to raise every conceivable legal problem along the way, delay along the way, prevarication, new evidence, new testimony. It is a nightmare for the government to confront this kind of a situation. Indeed, as you referred earlier, this may be bad for Obama, but for Obama to be made to look by Goldman Sachs to be unable to get a prosecution through because it takes longer than he will be president, because it will shift money in from the financial community to his opponent, Mr. Romney, instead of him. All of those problems play a role in having both sides back away. That's why it's a systemic problem. Even if we got rid of Goldman Sachs and its executives, we would put a new group of executives in facing the same incentives, the same rewards, and the same absence of punishment that would basically reproduce this activity.
Well, before we get on,
that's why all the regulations.
Before we get on to the systemic problems, Bartlett, Naylor, though, very quickly, the Department of Justice says, look, we are, though, cracking down on other malfeasance. The LIBOR scandal, for example, the London interbank offered rate scandal, the interest rate that banks give to each other, which then sets us a benchmark for the rest of us. They say they are cracking down. There are examples of the DOJ doing that.
Well, there are examples of investigations, but the number of people who have taken the perp walk or have gone to jail are basically minimal. To your one point of what is it that why did the Justice Department back away from this? And the best that I can imagine is that in the disclosure documents for the Abacus deal, for example, of Goldman Sachs.
A particular investment vehicle which was filled with terrible investments and sold as great.
Yes, there is language that says Goldman Sachs may take a position in opposition to its clients. I mean, what's wrong with that is that it's buried in a 500-page document, a disclosure document, and they put that in every document. So in other words, it's almost like saying, I'm going to cheat. Maybe, and if I do,
so they came clean.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Goldman Sachs already came clean.
Yes, it's in there, but basically it's
full disclosure
because it's there. That allows them to do whatever it is they want, even if it's deceitful and wrong. Well, in the end,
that's another interesting part. Mary Cruz McGowan. Then, I mean, another argument is, well, look at what's happening. It's not as if clients are deserting Goldman Sachs now that we know how murky their practices are, how they're routinely called muppets and so forth, as we've heard in other testimony from other members of Goldman Sachs. This is simply the nature of derivatives. It's the nature of the system. The clients know what they're getting. It certainly should be no secret now that Goldman Sachs are hedging and betting against their investments and so forth. This is just how this particular financial system works.
Exactly. It's as Professor Wolf was saying, this is a systemic problem.
But is it a problem? I mean, it seems certainly a lot of people seem to think, no, they're quite happy with the system.
And it is not a problem that is limited to Goldman Sachs. It could have been any other bank, and actually, it was more than Goldman Sachs. Maybe we are going first under this investigation because it was blatant.
Yeah, but I think maybe you misunderstand me. But the point is there a problem, or is this is how the late capitalist system actually works? It depends on this sort of behavior, perhaps. This is how the wheels keep moving.
No. Capitalism, I think, my opinion, works very well. But if there is a regulatory system that walks hand by hand with this capitalism, you cannot just open all this free market and have no regulations at all. And the second part of the regulation is you have to have them enforced. Because one practice that we have in Washington, D.C., in the government, is we write a lot of regulations and spend very little time in enforcing them. I think one of the problems that I am seeing on the banks is that they wrote the regulations, they didn't enforce its own regulations, they didn't make the SEC accountable for enforcing the regulations, and the response to that, they add more regulations and they incentive more mergers and acquisitions.
Right, you're assuming, though, that people believe in regulation. And Professor Wolf, I mean, the point is, though, a sizable chunk of those running our economy, in the White House as well as in the Republican Party, believe the system does work. It is about letting these sort of systems play out, though, surely. Isn't that part of it?
Absolutely. The ideology is that if you're a conservative most of the time, that the less government, the better, and you leave it all to the private sector, and it will all work everything out. The problem is every single time we've done that, we've walked ourselves into a catastrophe. One of the reasons, for example, we passed the Glass-Steagall Act, the control of banks after the Great Depression, is because it was crystal clear that using depositors' money for risky investments was a bad idea. No sooner was that regulation passed in 1933 then the banks went to work to evade it at first, weaken it second, and finally get rid of it in the late 1990s. And 8 years after it's finally gotten rid of, signed by Bill Clinton, we have the next collapse where, guess what? Institutions use depositors and investors' money in an inappropriately risky way with instruments they didn't even understand, let alone control. My disagreement with others is not about some idea of what regulation could do, but if you regulate and you leave in a position that heads of huge financial corporations who have every incentive to undo the regulation and get all the profits that enable them to realize that incentive, you're going to see the regulations not work. After 10 experiences of this, if all we do now is come up with yet another collection of regulations, we're not understanding the problem. It's systemic. You can't control it by another rule that they've shown themselves able to get around.
Bartlett, Naylor, I mean, there's that sense that once, there was some golden age where there was long-term greed, not short-term greed as we have now. And again, some people put that switch to the Clinton administration and Robert Rubin and others deregulating everything, frankly. But now, though, the idea of high risk, high reward no longer means taking a chance on an idea and seeing if it matures and so forth. But it's actually the high risk is taking a chance on an illegal action and seeing if you're caught, or even if you are caught, whether the cost-benefit analysis means it's worth it.
Yes, and the cost-benefit analysis of sanctions when you're caught show...
Right, which is why these regulations are pretty meaningless too.
Keep going
right?
it. Just one footnote to Professor Wolf's comment. Glass-Steagall, which worked from 1933 to 1999, was eroded by the banks, but a division within the banks. The reason that it remained intact is that the investment banks didn't want the commercial banks into their business. And it was Sandy Weil, for example, importantly, who advanced the question by merging the two, winning a reprieve from the Federal Reserve, and then shelling enough money into Congress to actually have the separation.
Who's now had a Damascene conversion.
That's right. Well, why that's particularly important is that he obviously knew how risky this was. He was on the front lines of managing risk. And 12 years later, he can see what he wrought, and he can see that, yes, it is impossible to disinfect the risk-averse, the love-to-win bankers from the hate-to-lose bankers, and that we should divorce these two practices and we should reduce the banks. One small point about Goldman Sachs, and I can't believe I'm defending this, but Goldman Sachs is somewhat different than, well, much different than Bank of America, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan. They are not retail. They are prop traders. Their mission in life is to rip the head off of their counterparties. Now, their counterparties might be clients in a conventional sense, but more often than not, they are people on the opposite side of a bet. Goldman Sachs doesn't have its name on a building. It doesn't advertise in the Olympics to please be our customer. It is in the business of winning, and there has to be a loser, and that's basically anybody on the other side of Goldman Sachs.
Well, let's just bring up a survey that was recently published, financial professionals in the US and the UK, and some of the themes that we've been discussing in the nature of the financial industry come out there. 24% of respondents said that people who work in financial services may need to engage in unethical or illegal conduct in order to be successful. 26% said they had first-hand knowledge of wrongdoing in the workplace. 30% say their bonus plan created pressure to compromise ethical standards or violate the law. And 16% say they would commit a crime like insider trading if they knew they could get away with it. Mary Cruz McGowan, you're talking about more regulations and more oversight. What hope does regulation and oversight have, though, if that is what basically the financial industry is based on? It is about making as much money as possible.
Basically, my point was that capitalism worked, but with the right and correct regulation that creates the disincentive to do something like that. For example, if the sanction to do one of those things will be higher than the profits that they will potentially get, there is the disincentive because they are all about cost-benefit analysis. If by doing something wrong, I'm going to get $100 million, no, it's money. It's a money thing, or going to jail. If by doing something wrong, I'm going to make $10 million this evening, but then the government comes after me and I have to go to jail for 10 years and pay $12 million, probably I will not do it because the cost of doing it will be higher than the cost of not doing it.
Professor Wolf, any chance?
No chance in the world. Are we being naive here? These bankers know. These bankers know, as do the large corporations and the rich. As the society becomes more and more unequal, as we have over the last 30 years, those in the position to have the wealth understand that politics is always the place where people might use universal suffrage to undo what is happening to them in economics. So if you want to control the wealth you've gathered in the economy, you'll have to use part of it to control politics. We're just watching that process. We haven't yet decided as a nation to do something about it.
Well, let's talk about how that process is now impacting, I was about to say infecting, every aspect of society. There was a deal announced just last week. Goldman Sachs is now looking to make a profit in the rehabilitation of prison inmates in New York City. It's put nearly $10 million into a 4-year scheme aimed at reducing recidivism or repeat offending among young prisoners at Rikers Island Prison. The firm will get its money back if there's a 10% drop in the number of youths who return to jail. However, if the numbers drop by less than 10%, the company could lose as much as $2.4 million. And if the rate of recidivism exceeds 10%, the New York government will pay back the investors with a possible profit of at least $2 million. So we're seeing this sort of financialized model now come into every aspect of our lives. Cap and trade, perhaps, is another example for, which has dubious impact on carbon dioxide, but makes certainly a lot of people a lot of money. And given the Goldman Sachs model and everything we know, surely they're hedging that reoffences will go up, actually, at the same time as they do this, right? I mean, isn't that how they must be working?
Well, to be frank, $10 million to Goldman Sachs is
so they think it's a PR thing.
It's the coffee money in the public relations department, I'm sure. The irony here is that we have a firm that is suffering from recidivism of infractions that's involved.
Exactly.
Involved.
But having said that, but surely though someone must be betting that reoffending is going to go up in New York, just even to hedge this one. No,
I think so.
If I could say a word. Yeah. If I could say a word, for Goldman Sachs, whose reputation has been tarnished because they rightly get a good bit of the anger in the population that is watching the dysfunctional economy bankrupt a dysfunctional politics, and people get angry at Goldman Sachs. They understood years ago they're going to have to spend money to recoup that reputation over time because it's politically dangerous not to do so. Throwing $10 million at the New York City prison system is a small outlay as part of a larger advertising budget. It makes them look.
I suppose what I was pointing to there was how the financial model, the corporatized, financial services model, is being used in the first place, actually, in social services and things like that. That was perhaps my concern.
Yeah,
yes,
right,
no, you're right. It has that quality.
Yeah,
it has that quality too, but fundamentally, this is an advertising program to make them look good. I mean, $10 million as a contribution in a system. The United States remains the country that has imprisoned more people per capita than any other advanced country. No one's even close. If Goldman Sachs had the slightest interest in dealing with this problem in our society, then it would commit something according to what it has available, which it has no interest in doing because this is a PR stunt and has really beyond that only secondary interest. They can do this little exercise of finance, but it's really a sideshow.
Mary Cruz McGowan, I mean, we've been hearing lots of reports about financiers complaining to President Obama and indeed to Romney, who shares that perplexion, actually, at the backlash against them. They truly believe that without them, we'd all be nothing. They are creating our prosperity, and they deserve to be in the 1%. But given that they are profiting at every stage, from boom to bust to stagnation, and now get away with it, perhaps they are better than us.
No. They are, I think, worse than most of us. But what happened is our system didn't allow them to be part of us. We allow these people to have those power. I agree with the professor that, yes, they are intertwined with politics, which means power, really, more than politics, and other banks. It's not only Goldman Sachs, even if the other banks are not investment banks.
Professor Wolff has put forward his theory as to why that is the case. Professor Wolff, you don't believe it's then regulation and so forth and, lovely congressional bills are the answer. What is the answer then?
The answer is to fundamentally question the system that we have. And there's multiple ways of doing that. For example, in a number of European countries, when after the Great Depression it was clear that the private banking system had been a major cause of the collapse, it was deemed appropriate to question whether it might be better to have something as fundamental as your financial system either done by the government or done in some partnership, which would at least make it more transparent, more accountable to democratic authority than leaving it in private hands. If we had a private public system that had performed as badly as our private banks, you could hear on every corner the demand to raise some fundamental questions. We ought to be doing that.
Professor
we ought
Wolff,
to be investigating
we have
public
to end
banking, and we ought to be investigating banking that was controlled by the workers who work in these banks, by the community that's represented, so we stop having this notion that allowing a handful of board of directors and major shareholders, 20, 30, 40 people, to make decisions over amounts of money and their impact on a society that make a mockery of any commitment to democracy at all.
Professor Wolff, thank you very much. Professor Richard Wolff. Mary Crease McGowan, thank you. Bartlett, Naylor, thank you. That's it from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.